Hi, everybody. Happy Monday afternoon. Welcome back to campus for some of you. I want to thank you all for coming to the History Department's 2023 E.E. McClellan Lecture, which we're presenting in conjunction with the university's focus theme for the year, and that's our timely big idea for Miami, which is the theme of tribal sovereignty. And we appreciate the help of the History Department and its SOAR committee, as well as Amy Bergerson and the Focus Committee. And our speaker this afternoon is Greg Ablavsky. Ablavsky is the Marion Rice Kirkwood Professor of Law and a professor by courtesy of history at Stanford. His scholarship focuses really on early American legal history, particularly issues of sovereignty, territory, property in the early American West, which includes Ohio in the early sense, the early West. His publications explore topics like the history of the U.S., the Indian Commerce Clause, and the importance of Indian affairs in shaping the U.S. Constitution. And his first book, which is called Federal Ground, was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. His work has received the Cromwell Article Prize and the Kathryn T. Prize from the American Society of Legal History. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ablavsky.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, especially because, as some of you may know, I was hoping to be with you here a couple weeks ago, but COVID got in the way of that. So I'm glad I'm healthy and able to join you here today. And thank you for your flexibility in dealing with this. Okay, so I was told that Rebecca Nagel actually already used this clip in her presentation. I'm going to use it again because it's a good clip. Hopefully, but I'm going to go in what I think is a slightly different direction from the direction that Rebecca took it in. So this for those of you, this is increasingly as I get older, my students are like, wait, things happened in the early 2000s. So this was President George W. Bush. He was president from 2000 to 2008. And if you were not alive, then the important thing to know about President Bush is he was known for sometimes putting his foot in his mouth, as the following clip will demonstrate.
My name is Mark Freeman. I'm the editor of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and a member of the Native American Journalists Association. Most school kids learn about government in the context of city, county, state, and federal. And of course, tribal governments are not part of that at all. Mr. President, you've been a governor and a president, so you have a unique experience looking at it from two directions. What do you think tribal sovereignty means in the 21st century? And how do we resolve conflicts between tribes and the federal and state governments?
Yeah. Tribal sovereignty means that, it's sovereign. It means you've been given sovereignty and you're viewed as a sovereign entity. And therefore, the relationship between the federal government and tribes is one between sovereignty.
Okay. So it's very easy to make fun of George W. Bush for many things, including this quote. But I actually think we should have a little bit of sympathy for him here, because it turns out that this term sovereignty is actually one of the most difficult and hardest terms to define in all of U.S. law. And in fact, if you go back to James Wilson, one of the key founders, one of the people who helped draft the U.S. Constitution, and who also served as a justice on the First U.S. Supreme Court, and you look at what he said, he actually said, who or what is a sovereign? What is his sovereignty? On this subject, the errors and mazes are endless and inexplicable. So this question of what sovereignty means, how to define it, what exactly are the rights that are associated with sovereignty, that is a persistent question that has been at the center of a lot of fights about U.S. law and about its relationship to Native peoples. Okay, so what I hope to do in my talk today is tell you a little bit about some of my research about where this idea about the concept of sovereignty in particular, this term and language of sovereignty, how that came to be associated with Native peoples and their rights to autonomy and self-governance, and how that got written into federal law. So that's the past of the title. And then I want to talk about some of the work that I think that this concept is doing today and that I anticipate in potentially it will do down the line, the past, the present and future. Okay, so let's start today with thinking about this key fact that undergirds everything that we're going to be talking about, something that I think we all obviously know, but we don't really, but that is nonetheless legally significant. So prior to European colonization, no one spoke or wrote about native sovereignty because obviously it is not an indigenous term. Native peoples govern themselves, but we didn't have this term because it was not a question, right? Indigenous peoples owned, governed, had the power in control pretty much all of North America. So then Europeans arrive, and they start to try to make sense of the indigenous societies and governments that they are encountering. So here, right, generalizing about indigenous governance is extremely hard, especially for people who, like me, are not native and so approach this as outsiders. But I think I want to talk a little bit about what some of the things that both European observers noted about indigenous societies, what they understood about indigenous societies, and some of the things that historians and anthropologists and native peoples themselves have talked about indigenous governance. So we're painting in a very broad brush here. But one of the things that was noteworthy was that when Europeans arrived, they talked about the fact that they thought native societies had kings, right? And they started using the language about royalty and monarchy to describe many of these indigenous societies. But many of them very quickly came to realize that actually indigenous governance operated differently than the way European governments did. That leadership meant something different within a native society than it meant in England or in France. So here I want to give you a quote from James Adair, who actually was a trader. He was an Anglo-American who lived in the Chickasaw Nation for a number of years and wrote one of these famous works, this History of American Indians in the 18th century. And he talks about the idea that the power of the chiefs is what he calls an empty sound. They can only persuade or dissuade the people by the force of good nature and clear reasoning. And elsewhere, he talks about the fact that they don't rely on coercive authority the way that existed within European society. So there are a couple interesting things about this quotation to my mind. So one, note that Adair observes the fact that there is some idea that there is something like power, but he doesn't quite identify or quite recognize what counts as power within indigenous society. He talks about, right, their use of persuasion, but he doesn't acknowledge that as a form of power. And then the second thing that is worth noting, though, is this acknowledgement that, in fact, native societies and peoples governed differently from Anglo-American society. And here, so my co-author, Justin Richland, who is an anthropologist, works closely and often quotes the Hopi anthropologist and Chief Justice of the Hopi Appellate Court, Emory Sekpatewa, and he talked about the core of Hopi governance, and I think in some ways indigenous governance in some broad sense, the core of it being this concept of cooperation without submission. In other words, you can see, I think, the link between what Adair is describing and what Sekpatewa is describing, this idea that governance within indigenous societies is not based on coercion in quite the same way that it was, that people like Adair thought that it was. Okay. So why was it that this aspect of indigenous governance, the way power operated and within the societies that Europeans encountered, why was it so difficult for people like Adair and others to comprehend? So here we're going to turn from the native societies to European societies. And here is where we start thinking about this term sovereignty and where exactly it came from. So what is the etymology of this term sovereignty? Well, so the Supreme Court these days, you might have noticed, really love, you probably know there are a lot of originalists on the Supreme Court. And the originalists love to go back and look at these dictionaries to try to figure out what these terms mean and where they came from. So if we go and look at Johnson's dictionary, which is one of these very important dictionaries from the 18th century, and you look at the term sovereignty, you see that the term sovereignty they describe as supremacy, highest place, supreme power, highest degree of excellence. And it comes from French and originally from Latin. And so you see that the history of this term is bound up with ideas about supremacy, right? About the idea of being the highest authority or power, and about this idea of command that is associated with the idea of what it is to, in fact, be a sovereign. Okay, so if you look, according to the political theorists who study these sorts of things, this idea of sovereignty really began in the 16th century with this French thinker, Jean Bodin, who writes a number of books dealing with sovereignty. And he describes sovereignty as the absolute and perpetual power of a commonwealth. So once again, right, this idea of coercion and also this absoluteness conception of sovereignty. And this then gets migrated into Anglo political thought. So you have people like Thomas Hobbes of the time, in the time period, right? People who are thinking about how sovereignty is organized within a society, how power operates, and the idea that there will be considerable authority and power concentrated in the sovereign. So this is the idea of internal sovereignty. In other words, how Europeans imagined that power was organized and operated within European society. But that doesn't tell us the question about how sovereigns and societies interact with each other. This question of what political scientists and international relations people call external sovereignty. In other words, sovereignty that is arrayed outward. So here we talk very briefly about what was happening in Europe during this time period. So in the 17th century, as some of you may know, there were a lot of intense wars going on over religion. There was the whole series of wars that were being fought throughout this time period, culminating in the 30 Years' War that devastated much of what is present-day Germany. And this ends in 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia, which produces what international relations people talk about as the Westphalian system. And the idea of the Westphalian system, and you can sort of see it on this map here, is that in order to end these wars of religion, they agree that each nation will be a nation state. It will have defined borders and territory, and its internal affairs will be its internal concern. Each nation will get to decide its own matters, including its own religion. And each state will be equal formally within this system. This is, international relations scholars love to talk about this system of Westphalian sovereignty, of the world divided up into so many of, equally sovereign, independent nations. Okay, so one of the things that historians love to do, if any of you have spent time with historians, you know that one of our favorite things to do is just tell people it was more complicated than that. And some historians have complicated Westphalian sovereignty too and said, look, never really existed in quite that same way, it was more complicated. For now, I'm going to acknowledge that it was more complicated, but just to say that many of people in Europe really believed in this idea of the concept of Westphalian sovereignty and the idea of all these independent, equal, sovereign nations as a way to try to secure stability within Europe. And it became really central to the legal thinking of this time period, much of which became particularly codified in this dude here who wears this cool cap. This man is named Emmerich de Vattel, and he is actually a Swiss author who writes this very famous book, the Droit de gens, in French, but very quickly translated into English during this time period as the Law of Nations. And this was, in the 18th century, the most important book on what we would now call international law. It really heavily shaped the way that people thought about international law during this time period. So what did Vattel have to say about international law? Well, Vattel is one of the key writers who makes the language, who really emphasizes this language and concept of sovereignty. And you see his quotation here, of all the rights that belong to a nation, sovereignty is the most precious, and that other nations ought to the most scrupulously to respect. Okay. So what are the rights of sovereignty according to Vattel? Well, one of the most important things is, again, this idea of equality of nations. That each sovereign nation is obligated by the law of nations to respect the sovereignty of other nations and not to interfere in their affairs. And for him, the key concept behind this, the way to capture this concept of sovereignty, is the language of free and independent, right? In order to be a sovereign nation, you have to be a free and independent nation. And this language shows up a lot in Vattel. In fact, it shows up like 9 times in just the first chapter alone. So he loves using these words over and over again. Now, some of you, hopefully, are like, this language sounds vaguely familiar, free and independent. And one reason that it might sound familiar is that not because you've been pouring through Vattel, but you might have read this document here, the Declaration of Independence. And if you read the Declaration of Independence and you look, you see that actually what it says at the end is that the key thing that it announces is that the United States will be free and independent states. In other words, the Declaration of Independence is an assertion of sovereignty under this Vattellian frame. It is an assertion that the United States is one of the powers of the earth. That language shows up also in the Declaration. That is a sovereign nation among the community of sovereign nations in this deep Vattellian frame. Now, you don't have to take my word for it that they were reading Vattel. You can take Benjamin Franklin's word for it, who said, oh yeah, when we were writing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we had Vattel all the time in front of us. We relied very heavily on Vattel. Or you can take from it the fact that George Washington actually borrowed Vattel's Law of Nations from the library and did not return it for 220 years. They finally discovered it. I just love the fact that it was the Law of Nations. Like, this book so perfectly encapsulates what I'm trying to articulate here, which is this idea that they were drawing on this idea of what it meant to be a sovereign nation during this time period that was floating around in international law. And that the United States was using this language of sovereignty right at this moment of the American Revolution to assert what it was to be a nation. Okay. So there is this vibrant discourse of sovereignty floating around during this same time period that is closely associated with the rise of the United States. Okay. So you might be thinking, well, all of this is very interesting, but what does it have to do, or maybe not so interesting, but what does it have to do with Native peoples? Okay. So this is a map of the United States as it was defined in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So this is the treaty that ends the American Revolution. And by the way, in that treaty, Britain acknowledges the United States as free and independent states. So once again, this language of free and independent shows up again. But if you zoom in on the territory of the United States, you can actually see on this very early map, you see that Native peoples, Native nations are identified on this map. So you see, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Creeks on this particular portion of the map. If you zoom in on where we are now, you can actually see the Miami Nation identified on the map as well. Okay. So from the beginning, there is this question about what is the relationship between the United States, which now claims to have these borders, it claims to have this territory, and the Native peoples who are incorporated within its borders without any acknowledgement, without their consent. This treaty was signed without their input. So now, all of a sudden, these Native peoples find themselves within ostensibly this country that claims to be a sovereign. Okay. So the United States has a vision for what this relationship is. The United States comes to native leaders in the wake of the war, and it says, we defeated both the British and you, the native peoples, because many of you allied with the British. And so they say, you are no longer free and independent. They use that language. You are a subdued people. In other words, they're telling native peoples that they are no longer sovereign nations, but now are subordinate in some ways to the United States. And what you see is that native peoples reject this interpretation, and they reject this interpretation using this very same language. So here we have the Haudenosaunee Mohawk leader, Joseph Brant. But actually, there are lots of native leaders, Alexander McGillivray, a Muskogee leader, Joseph Galfin, who's also a Muskogee leader during this time period. This is a generation of native leaders who, many of them were actually educated in, they spoke English fluently, they were educated in American or in British schools. They were very familiar with the Anglo-American culture. And they used this language of freedom and independence to assert their own claim to their own claim to nationhood. And so I think this quote from Joseph Brant actually captures this most clearly, right? You see this language where they say, we are of the same opinion with the people of the United States. You consider yourselves as independent people. We, as the original inhabitants of this country and sovereigns of the soil, look upon ourselves as equally independent and free as any other nation or nations. So this quote, I think, captures a lot in just a few lines. So in the few lines, what you see is that you, the United States, you are claiming to be a sovereign nation. We, the Haudenosaunee, we, the Miami, we, these other native nations, we have the same right to nationhood as you. We too can claim, and you see, this is, I mean, he's writing this in English. We can have the same claim to be free and independent as any other nation or nations. But you also see embedded within it, right, the original inhabitants of this country and sovereigns of the soil. So he's using the language of sovereignty, but he's tying it to a conception of indigeneity, right? We are the original inhabitants of the soil, and using that as a claim for sovereignty. So I would suggest to you that this moment in the late 18th century, where McGillivray and Brant and a whole number of other native leaders start to repurpose this language, this is the moment that the idea of native or indigenous sovereignty is created. Not as an idea, again, of indigenous self-governance or autonomy or this other language that had these very deep roots in what it meant to be native peoples, but the idea that sovereignty was the way to express this in the legal framework of the United States, that comes out of this moment. It is this moment when native leaders start to use this language of sovereignty to try to push back against what the United States is telling them. Because the United States is telling them, you are no longer sovereign, you have been conquered. And they say, no, we have an equal right to be nations as you, the United States. It is a profound, just as profound a declaration of independence as the one that the United States had made only a few years earlier. And what's really remarkable about this is that it actually succeeds in many ways. Because the United States, not necessarily because the United States is feeling particularly charitable or gracious toward native peoples, but because the United States has just come out of a very expensive war. It has no money, it has no military, it is deathly afraid of fighting these powerful native confederacies. And you actually see that the United States retreats to an acknowledgement of indigenous sovereignty. And so if you look at the sort of founding generation, the people that we think of as the founders, many of them made statements endorsing the concept of indigenous sovereignty. I think Thomas Jefferson offers the most robust one, where he tells a bunch of British negotiators that Native peoples have undivided and independent sovereignty as long as they choose to keep it, and that this might be forever. So again, using this language of sovereignty and recognizing and acknowledging the nationhood of Native peoples. And to a certain extent, this gets written into the US Constitution itself, right? So the US Constitution puts in what gets known as the Indian Commerce Clause, it talks about commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. Again, ranking Native peoples alongside other sovereigns in that list. Okay. So this question, okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. So we still, though, have this dilemma, at least a dilemma in the eyes of Anglo-Americans, which is that the borders of the United States still encompass these native nations, right? So how is it that you can have two sovereign nations occupy the same territory? Well, Native people say, well, we are not in your territory. We never chose to be part of it. We have our own independent territory. But of course, federal leaders are unwilling to acknowledge that. And so there's a lot of debate and argument about, for the next 40 years, about what the exact status of Native peoples within the borders of the United States are. There's an intense debate about this during the War of 1812. There's actually a heated exchange between the Americans and the British at the end of that war about what exactly Native status is. But I want to fast forward now to the 1820s and 1830s, because this is when the question of what the exact status of Native nations is under federal law becomes especially acute. And it does so in the course of the crisis that usually gets described as removal. But I think other historians have argued persuasively that we should think about this much more as forced deportation of Native peoples from, most famously the South, but really from across the eastern United States. And the way you probably got taught removal in high school is, this is a story about Andrew Jackson and about his role in all of this. And the intense politics around this. But I also think it's important to stress that what ended up happening was an intense fight about what exactly does sovereignty mean during this time period. What exactly does, and particularly what does native sovereignty mean and what rights does it encompass? So part of what's going on is that particularly in the Southeast, but again, not just in the Southeast, we saw the way that Native leaders were very good at using this language of sovereignty to resist Anglo-American colonialism. Well, if you fast forward to the 1820s, you see that the Cherokee Nation, other Native nations, are actually doing the same thing even more aggressively. So in 1826, the Choctaw Nation adopts a written constitution, just like the United States and just like the states had done. The Cherokee do the same thing the following year in 1827 in a constitution that is written in both Cherokee and in English. And if you look at the second article of the Cherokee Constitution, you see that it says the sovereignty and jurisdiction of this government shall extend over the country within the boundaries above described. So the first article lays out the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation, and the second article proclaims the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation. So what is the Anglo-American response to this aggressive assertion of native sovereignty? Panic. Particularly panic in the South, in the states like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, that also claim to be sovereign. So it's important to remember when we're talking about sovereignty during this time period, we're talking about the sovereignty of the United States, we're talking about sovereignty of native nations, but we're also talking about the sovereignty of the states, which also claim to be sovereigns in some sense during this time period. And so you see, this is John Quincy Adams, the president at the time. And in the State of the Union, he talks about how we have unexpectedly found them, meaning Native peoples, forming in the midst of ourselves communities claiming to be independent of ours and rivals of sovereignty within the territories of the members of our union. Rivals of sovereignty. So I think it's very clear, we can see how ridiculous this assertion is, right? The idea that, oh, unexpectedly we found amidst ourselves, there were native nations. Native peoples actually forcefully assert the opposite. They say, we have been here all along, we have been sovereign, you are the ones who are starting to claim to create sovereign entities within our borders. And we actually see this whole generation of leadership among the Cherokees and other native nations who are pressing the argument for Cherokee sovereignty. And they say, look, we are a free and distinct nation, and the government of the United States has no police, meaning power, police authority, over us other than regulating our trade. So these native leaders have sort of picked up on that earlier discourse of free and independent nationhood, and they are continuing to use it to push back against both the federal and the state governments. Okay. So what happens subsequently? Well, as some of you may know, this clash reaches ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court in a series of cases known as the Marshall Trilogy. And I think about them in analogy to the Star Wars trilogy, particularly the now I got kicked, get lost, now this is the prequel trilogy, in part because these decisions from the perspective of native leaders, they start out very bad and they get by the end maybe kind of tolerable, a little bit like the Star Wars prequel. So this is known as the Marshall Trilogy because these are actually all written by Chief Justice John Marshall. And so there are these three cases: Johnson versus McIntosh, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and Worcester versus Georgia. And what these cases confront is the question about native status that had been lurking from the beginning. In other words, what exactly is the relationship between native nations and the United States, and what does native sovereignty mean under federal law? And Chief Justice John Marshall attempts to give an answer in these three cases. Okay, so let's start with Johnson versus McIntosh. So Johnson versus McIntosh is really a case about land and property and about conflicting land claims. But one of the questions that comes up in Johnson versus McIntosh is, how is it that the United States can claim sovereignty over native peoples in the first place? And so what Marshall says is, look, native nations were admitted to be occupants of the soil that have legal ownership, but because they were incorporated within the boundaries of the United States, their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations were necessarily diminished. Now, he doesn't go on to exactly define how they were diminished, but what he's saying is merely because they're within the borders of the United States, that has in some way limited the scope of native sovereignty. Okay, so that is the first case. And then the Cherokee Nation, in its attempt to resist, so what Georgia does, Georgia passes a series of laws saying, look, we are the state of Georgia, we have sovereignty over this territory. We are just going to pass laws that basically outlaw the existence of the Cherokee government. We are going to make it criminal to have a native government within these borders. It is basically a naked assertion of power. And you see, right, if you think about sovereignty as supremacy, the way that we've been talking about, if you are sovereign, you get the ultimate say. So if the state of Georgia is sovereign within its borders, then the state of Georgia gets to tell the Cherokee Nation that it cannot exist within those borders. So what happens in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia is that the Cherokee Nation hires a very good lawyer and it takes this case to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the question there is the Cherokee Nation a foreign nation? because the Cherokees sued under a provision of the Constitution that says the Supreme Court has jurisdiction over disputes between a foreign nation and a state. And basically what Marshall says is he says, look, we acknowledge that the Cherokee Nation governs itself. He says, look, all of this argument that was intended to prove that they were separate, that they managed its own affairs, that was successful. The Cherokee Nation has proven that it is in some way sovereign. What it has not proven, in his view, is that they are a foreign nation. Instead, he coins this term domestic dependent nations to describe native status. So what exactly does he mean by this term domestic dependent nations? Well, the term nations captures this idea of sovereignty, right? He's associating this first part, acknowledging their sovereignty, that is captured by the idea of nationhood. So it's important to stress, Marshall is not saying that native peoples are not sovereign. What he is saying, however, is that they are not fully independent sovereigns. They are not free and independent the same way that the United States is. He is saying that they are domestic. What does he mean by domestic? He means they are within the borders of the United States. And they are dependent. What he means by dependent is that their sovereignty is somehow subordinate to that of the United States. That in some fashion, their sovereignty is less than that of the United States. He doesn't define exactly how, but he is suggesting that they are not fully independent nations the way that the Cherokee Nation had asserted. Okay. So that then brings us to the last of the trilogy, Worcester versus Georgia. So in Worcester versus Georgia, the Cherokee Nation actually successfully gets its claim before the U.S. Supreme Court. And what Marshall says is actually that the Cherokee Nation is sovereign enough not to be subordinate to Georgia. In other words, that Georgia has no claim to sovereignty within the borders of the Cherokee Nation. Okay. And invalidates Georgia's claim to jurisdiction. So I think these three cases define the core of native sovereignty within federal law, not only in the 1830s, but in many ways they remain the foundation of the legal concept of native sovereignty. And you see how they both resolve and don't resolve many of the questions of native legal status. Because on the one hand, they acknowledge that native peoples are sovereign and that they govern themselves, that they are independent in some sense. But they are not fully independent nations, according to Marshall. They are in some ways under the authority of the United States. So this idea of quasi-sovereignty, this idea that native peoples have something like sovereignty but are still subject to the United States, this is Marshall's solution to the problem of how you can have a nation within a nation. Okay. We're going to fast forward quite a bit now to the late 19th century. So those are the foundational cases of the Marshall Trilogy. By the late 19th century, Anglo-Americans basically have rejected the idea of native sovereignty altogether. There's a case called Kagama that happens in the late 19th century, and Kagama basically says the federal government can do whatever it wants with respect to native nations. It has what is known as plenary power in this area. And it says there are only two sovereigns in the United States, the federal government and the states. And so because the states don't have authority here, the federal government has to have authority. So this is a very famous case. There's actually a less famous case called Montoya, but that I think captures how far the idea of sovereignty has fallen out of federal law by this point. They basically, in this quote, they say, look, the term nation implies independence, an organized government, recognized officials, a system of laws, definite boundaries, and the power to enter into negotiations with other nations. Now, every single one of those attributes, as we saw, native nations were acknowledged to have possessed at the founding era. But by 1901, the Supreme Court basically says, we don't think that the federal government ever really acknowledged native peoples had those attributes. So this is the low point of the concept of native sovereignty in federal law. But even at this low point, I want to stress, Native peoples are still successfully governing themselves, right? Simply because the Supreme Court said something did not actually make it a reality on the ground. And so, despite all these challenges, despite the many attacks during this time period on Native self-governance, it's still going on. They're still sort of forcing the federal government to acknowledge these rights of self-governance. And it only lasts a relatively brief period. By 1934, you get the Indian Reorganization Act and the so-called Indian New Deal. Basically, what happened is in the 1920s, a whole bunch of Native people started organizing. You have the formation of the Society of American Indians. And they successfully pushed back against the attacks on Native sovereignty. And the Indian Reorganization Act creates a template of basically tribal autonomy and self-governance through the creation of these, tribal constitutions. Now, there are a lot of critiques of the Indian Reorganization Act because it basically uses the federal government to go out and create these sort of cookie cutter constitutions and apply them to tribes across the country. This is not sort of tribes necessarily deciding for themselves what they want their constitutions to look like. And for many Native nations, they've been this long process of getting rid of these old IRA constitutions and replacing them with their own tribal constitutions. But I think the core concept that Native people that federal acknowledgement and recognition of Native sovereignty comes out of this moment, a resurgence in the 1930s. And then if we fast forward to the 1970s, we get President Nixon making this very important announcement where he embraces the idea of what he calls self-determination, right? This idea that the federal government is no longer going to paternalistically tell Native peoples what it thinks is best for them, but instead going to allow Native peoples to make those decisions for themselves. Now, there's something interesting. If you go and look at Nixon's statement on self-determination, if you go and read the whole thing, the word sovereignty never appears in that document. Only language about self-determination. And I think that's for a reason, because if you look at what has happened in the ensuing 50 years, we see, I think, an extraordinary resurgence of the ability of Native nations to actually meaningfully govern themselves. And if you look over even just the past few years, what you see is, I think, really impressive and important models for cooperation between Native nations and other sovereigns, particularly the federal government. So you have Bears Ears, where the federal government has created a national monument that is going to be governed and managed in partnership with a coalition of Native communities in the Southwest. We have seen the enactment of the Violence Against Women Act, which expands the scope of tribal jurisdiction to include some offenses that committed against indigenous people, intended particularly to try to push back against the epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous people. So what we've seen is this model that I think is based in ideas about cooperation, about ideas of Native peoples to govern themselves. And I think what's interesting about this is that this is not necessarily rooted in the older ideas about sovereignty in the same way. In other words, if we think about sovereignty as being about supremacy, about absolute control, remember those definitions that we saw at the beginning? That is not exactly how power and authority are operating in this. This is a model of conversation, a model of cooperation, a model where parties are coming to the table and trying to work out what is best for multiple sovereigns involved. And so what we've seen in recent years is we've seen language, the use of the language of sovereignty, ideas about, you've probably talked about ideas about food sovereignty or data sovereignty, that are rooted in these long-standing arguments for indigenous self-governance, for autonomy. And I think what's remarkable about these uses of the term sovereignty is that they diverge a little bit from these older legal meanings, and they are much closer to this sort of cooperation without submission idea that we saw at the beginning. In other words, they're much closer to indigenous ideas about governance than these Anglo-American ideas about the way that government should operate. And so I think this is in some ways a exciting repurposing of this language of sovereignty or reuse of its language. And I think actually this is a good thing, right? I think it's great if the language of sovereignty can shed some of these coercive connotations that it had in the late 18th century. Nonetheless, however, there is an area where this older language of sovereignty is still doing a lot of work. And that is unsurprisingly in the area of law, which is an area that I spend a lot of time in. And what you see is that law is associated with conflict, right? And sovereignty is still very important when it comes to these situations where people are fighting about power. And in particular, where native nations are trying to assert rights to govern themselves and the people who are on their land, and states and others resist. And so if you look just in the past few years, we've seen many, many fights over these questions. So we've seen the many fights that came out of McGirt, where the state of Oklahoma has challenged rights of native nations to govern people within their territories, to claim immunity from state taxation and other aspects of state governance. This is an ongoing battle that is not going to be resolved anytime soon, and there will be lots of litigation and lawsuits. We saw fights in the middle of COVID lockdowns where Lakotas and others in South Dakota and elsewhere established COVID checkpoints, and the governor of the state argued that these were actually illegal and called on the federal government to crack down on them. And we've seen in Montana, there is currently a fight going on about whether the Blackfoot Nation can enforce its own vaccine requirement against a non-native business, and in particular whether the state of Montana can impose its own law that says that businesses cannot impose a vaccine mandate within the state of Montana. So in other words, all of these are fights over sovereignty in that sense that I was talking about at the beginning. They are fights about which government gets the final say, which government gets to have the power to have the ultimate authority within its territory. And it's not surprising that many of these fights have taken the form of states versus native peoples, just like what we saw in Georgia during the era of Indian removal. In many ways, these are playing out some of those same fights after all. And so here, I think, is where this language of sovereignty in the original sense, in this original definition, is still doing some of the most important work, like when those native leaders invoked it all those years ago in the founding era. And we've seen fights that have reached the US Supreme Court over specifically about this concept of these concepts of jurisdiction and sovereignty. And here, I think, is where this language of sovereignty is still doing important legal work. It is making space for native self-governance and autonomy in the same way that it did all those years ago. Now, that doesn't mean that this language is that invoking native sovereignty and the law surrounding it, those foundational opinions, is going to work. One of the key things of Castro Huerta, which was a case that the Supreme Court decided just last summer, was they basically said, we know we said in Worcester versus Georgia that native nations are exempt from state law, but Worcester versus Georgia is no longer the law of the land, and so we're throwing out much of those principles. So we see a Supreme Court that is willing to sort of move away from some of these foundational principles of native sovereignty. And I think many of us in federal Indian law are waiting to see what comes of the Burkeen case, which is a challenge to the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act, but could have very profound and meaningful implications for tribal sovereignty. As I think if you, when Rebecca Nagel came, probably she perhaps spoke a little bit about in her podcast, This Land, speaks about in much more detail what some of the consequences of this decision could be for native sovereignty. So we're in a moment where the ideas about native sovereignty are very much in flux, where, especially before the court, and where the work that it does to try to secure the independence and autonomy of native peoples is really quite important. But I also don't want you to think that this is all doom and gloom in front of this Supreme Court. Some of you might have seen, although I think it got a lot less media attention, this case called the United States versus Cooley that the court decided back in 2021. And in Cooley, they actually upheld the right of the Apsalaka, the Crow Nation's police, to detain a non-Indian on the reservation as a principle of inherent tribal sovereignty. So this, and it was a unanimous decision, which I did not think we were going to see in Indian law for a very long time. And so I think, there are things you can point to explain what's going on in Cooley, like many of the conservative justices on the court really, really like police, and so they're going to side with police. But nonetheless, the way the law works is that now we have this decision on the books. They have blessed tribal sovereignty in this instance. And I think that this precedent is going to be important down the line when another native nation wants to assert sovereignty over non-native people within their borders, they can invoke this case. And so I think what this case shows is that ideas about native sovereignty are still doing work in front of this Supreme Court with zealous advocacy and in the cases where there are good facts that you can get in front of this court. Okay. So what does this mean for the future of tribal sovereignty? Well, in some ways, I think we're going to see a little bit more of the same. So I think what we will see in coming years is that more and more recognition, especially by the federal government, especially by the executive and hopefully Congress, that tribal governments are, at the end of the day, governments, like other governments. That they are trying to use their authority to secure the best for their citizens. That just like other governments in the United States, they sometimes mess up. But that, like other governments in the United States, like the federal government, they have an important role and function to do, and that they deserve dignity and respect the same kind of dignity and respect that the Supreme Court and the federal government accords other sovereigns. And this is a really important role for this language about sovereignty, potentially. But I also think we will see, I hope, more of the kind of moving away from the fixation about ideas of supremacy that we've seen in recent years. In other words, my hope, and we've seen this in some instances, is cooperation between governments. Cooperation where people recognize that tribes and states and the federal government can be partners with each other to help build a better future for everyone, native and non-native within their borders, rooted not in who gets the fixation about who gets the final say all the time, but in this idea of cooperation without submission that really is deeply rooted in ideas about indigenous governance. So I think that's the optimistic take about what the future holds. The pessimistic take is that I don't think that the legal challenges that we have seen in cases like Castro Huerta or in Burkina are going to go away. I think that with the continued assertion of tribal governments, we are going to continue to see some pushback and challenges in the courts. And so here, I think, is where these long-standing ideas about sovereignty that Native peoples have fought for so long can do some of their most important work in the courts today. That is, they provide an important bulwark to emphasize the fact that from the beginning, the United States acknowledged that Native peoples had this legal idea that they called sovereignty, and that this was a recognition and acknowledgement of space for indigenous self-governance and autonomy. And so I think that this language of sovereignty is going to have to continue to do the same work that it did all those years ago at the founding era. It is going to have to be a shield to try to protect Native peoples against assaults on their ability to try to, as best they can, manage their lands, to govern their people, to govern the people who are in Native territory for the benefit of everyone there. I think we're going to see more fights, particularly in the Supreme Court, about what exactly the scope of that is, and I think the sovereignty is going to continue to be really important as those fights unfold in future years. So this is where I think we are. We're at a moment where there's great opportunities for cooperation, but there's also great challenges ahead, particularly in the courts. And so I think that is where at least I see the language of sovereignty really continuing to be vital to protect Native nations. Okay, so there you have it. In hopefully a relatively short period, the past, present, and future of Native sovereignty. Thanks for bearing with me as we stroll through Vattel and Jean Bodin, but I hope you can see how this long arc of this concept really helps us understand where it came from and how valuable it continues to be in the present.